She had never been one to hold her tongue. To her, Brian was the very definition of everything wrong with men like him: arrogant, untouchable, and dripping with money that gave him the right to treat the world like it was his playground. So when their paths collided and she called him rude and proud in front of an audience that usually bowed at his feet, everyone expected fireworks. They expected him to lash out, to humiliate her, to prove her right. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, the billionaire everyone feared leaned back, studied her like she was the most fascinating puzzle he'd ever seen, and smiled. Not the smug, sharp smile his rivals knew, but something softer, something disarming. And then he answered her words with love. Not with rage, not with ego, but with patience and charm that made her pulse skip. For the first time in her life, she didn't know if she had misjudged him, or if she had just stumbled into a dangerous game she wasn't ready to play. Because men like Brian didn't fall in love. They conquered. And yet somehow, with one unexpected answer, the powerful billionaire began rewriting the rules she thought she knew by heart. The first tray of champagne glasses had already left a dull ache in my arms, and the glittering ballroom looked like another planet I had no business stepping into. Crystal chandeliers poured light across polished marble, gowns shimmered like waterfalls, and the air smelled of money. Money so thick you could almost choke on it. I adjusted the black apron tied at my waist, forcing my chin high even though my shoes pinched. A temp catering shift, Rowena had reminded me, was better than nothing. Rent didn't pay itself, and Josiah's prescriptions were waiting on the pharmacy counter. But standing there, weaving through peacocks and silk and men with cufflinks that could probably pay off my student loans, I felt like a shadow stitched wrong into the scene. I tried to focus on the rhythm of service: offer, smile, step back, repeat. The ballroom pulsed with laughter and clinking glasses. At the far end, Clarissa, our host for the evening, was gliding between circles of donors, her ruby gown cutting through the crowd like a flame. Beside her, Yvette, the director of the community clinic, was radiant in midnight blue. She was the only reason I had agreed to this gig at all. If this gala raised enough funds, Josiah might actually get that surgery before his condition worsened. I whispered to myself, just survive the night, then get out. The tray wobbled as I sidestepped a man too busy bragging about stocks to notice me. My wrist tensed. One wrong move and a river of champagne would rain across $1,000 shoes. I ducked my head, pretending invisibility worked, when a figure suddenly cut across my path. I jolted back. The tray tipped, liquid sloshing dangerously. I steadied it at the last second, heart slamming, and then I saw him. Brian. Every whisper in the city knew his name. The youngest to build a multinational from scratch, ruthless in the boardroom, a man people called both visionary and vulture. Tall, sharp suit, eyes like steel tempered in winter storms. His reputation preceded him: brilliant, merciless, untouchable. And now he was blocking me. "Watch it," he said, voice clipped, low enough not to draw attention but sharp enough to slice. He didn't even look at me at first, just at the tray like I was a clumsy child. Heat rushed to my cheeks. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the endless little humiliations of being invisible until you made a mistake. Maybe it was the way he didn't even bother to meet my eyes. But I had never been good at swallowing my tongue. "Rude," I blurted before sense could stop me. "And proud." The words carried. They shouldn't have, but the music had lulled, and suddenly the syllables stretched through the ballroom. Conversations stuttered. A ripple of silence spread, quick and lethal. My stomach plummeted, every head turned. Champagne bubbles hissed faintly, the only sound. I should have apologized. I should have lowered my gaze, mumbled an excuse, slunk away. That's what everyone expected, because no one ever challenged Brian. Instead, I stood frozen, cheeks burning, pulse a drumbeat in my throat. Brian's head turned at last, those slate-gray eyes pinning me. They were unreadable, colder than glass. I braced myself for humiliation, for him to sneer, to cut me down, to prove the story's right. But he didn't. The corner of his mouth curved, not in mockery, but in something that stole the breath from my lungs. A smile, gentle, almost curious. He leaned back slightly, studying me as though I'd said the most fascinating thing he'd heard all night. Is that so? His voice dropped softer, smoother than velvet stretched over steel. Rude and proud? The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion, waiting for him to bury me. But Brian only set his glass on a passing tray, his gaze never leaving mine. You're the first person in years who's been honest to my face. I blinked. The words didn't compute. He should have been furious. Instead, his tone carried a hint of amusement? Respect? Tell me, he added, tilting his head. Do you always speak what you see? The blood roared in my ears. My mouth went dry, but my pride kept me from looking away. Only when men like you forget that the rest of us exist. A collective gasp. Somewhere near the bar, someone muttered, "She's finished." But Brian didn't bristle. He didn't turn away. He smiled wider, softer still, a flash of warmth where there should have been fire. Well, he said at last, I've been called worse. Laughter, low, startled, rippled through the room. The tension fractured. Conversations resumed, though heads kept flicking our way. Clarissa's painted smile twitched with intrigue. Yvette's eyes shone with something closer to admiration. My chest heaved, hands trembling around the tray. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the floor. Instead, Brian stepped closer and the world shrank to the space between us. You have courage, he murmured, quiet enough for only me. Or recklessness. Maybe both. His nearness unsettled me more than his reputation ever had, because there was no anger in his gaze, only something that looked dangerously like interest. I gripped the tray tighter, forcing steel into my spine. And you have an audience, Mr. Knight. Don't let me keep you. I turned sharply, heart racing, desperate to escape. My shoes clicked too loud against the marble as I retreated toward the service doors. But even as I fled, I felt his gaze follow like a thread stitched between us. Behind me, I heard him laugh, low, genuine, startling. The kind of laugh that didn't match the man the world had painted. And the sound burrowed deep under my skin. In the service corridor, cool air rushed over me, and I leaned against the wall, trembling. Rowena's voice buzzed in my head, sharp and protective. Don't pick fights with kings unless you're ready to lose your crown. But I hadn't lost. Not exactly. What had just happened? I closed my eyes, the image replaying, the smile, the warmth, the way he'd looked at me as though I wasn't invisible. It was absurd. Dangerous. Men like Brian didn't answer challenges with kindness. They conquered. They crushed. And yet, somehow, he had answered me with something that left me more off balance than any insult could have. I pressed a hand to my racing heart. This night was supposed to be simple. Work, earn, go home. But now I had lit a match in a room soaked with gasoline. I didn't know if it would burn me alive or light the path to something I wasn't ready for. Dawn lifted over the city like a careful hand. In a narrow kitchen, the kettle rattled while rent notices curled beside a pill organizer. Marjorie moved through steam and pale light with the calm of someone who had rehearsed 1,000 small salvations. She decided which bill would wait, which promise would not. Josiah woke to her knock, younger than the machines suggested, hoodie too large, smile trained to pretend fatigue was a joke he could tell twice. The monitor on his wrist blinked a schedule their lives obeyed. She checked his meds, bribed him with tea, and tucked a blanket around stubborn legs that still remembered running. Fear would not be named before breakfast. Rowena's name flashed before the kettle clicked. She kept the perimeter warm. Snacks, sarcasm, spare keys. She knew the gala story, how a moment can turn a room to glass, and she knew courage without logistics becomes martyrdom. Her messages arrived like scaffolding: bus routes, clinic hours, a grocery order already placed. She admired rebellion that budgeted and trusted Marjorie to draw lines in ink. Today's line was simple and unbending: dignity is not negotiable, even when rent stares like an unpaid witness. Across the river, Brian ended an unslept night by straightening papers that did not need straightening. Precision was his superstition. Order a prayer he trusted more than faith. His apartment was glass and altitude, the view layered like strategies. He had been many versions of himself: boy who learned silence, man who learned leverage, leader who learned the room will applaud if you teach it how. Nelson arrived early, as always. The chief of staff carried calendars like a conductor carries time and kept mercies in his pocket, reminders to check on staff, to send flowers without cards, to insist audits remain independent. He read the room that was Brian's silence and held the news until asked. When asked, he told it plain. No scandal last night, only surprise. She called you rude and proud. You answered with grace. Something in Brian's shoulders loosened, not quite a smile, almost a permission. He filed the sensation beside figures and forecasts, and did not yet name it. Brian's talent had long been control. His flaw had been the same. He wondered what it would cost to practice a different art: listening that does not stage its reply. At the clinic, Yvette sorted forms with the patience of a surgeon and the stubbornness of a gardener. The fundraiser could be the bridge or the river. She chose bridge and drew budgets that made hope measurable. She knew how to coax bloom from poor soil: oversight, transparency, rituals that place dignity first. When Marjorie arrived, Yvette offered a hug disguised as logistics. She believed in scaffolding more than speeches, and in people who show up before applause learns their names. Gideon entered the day as perfume enters a room, confident he would be noticed. He was a rival shaped like a compliment, an elegant sabotage with perfect posture. He inquired about oversight and smiled when told there was plenty. He left a card that felt heavier than paper, as if gravity respected his intentions. Erosion never hurried, neither did he. His questions mapped fault lines, his charm disguised a surveyor's stake. He preferred stories told in whispers because whispers do not leave signatures. Nelson met Marjorie at noon in a cafe softened by ivy and water. He presented himself not as a gate, but as a bridge. The invitation was simple: collaborate publicly in service of the clinic. Shape a narrative that centers patients rather than men. Define the terms yourself. Darius joined briefly, the head of PR who imagines disasters before they happen. Exposure can be mitigated, he explained, not erased. If the story threatened Josiah's privacy, the plan would change, not the patient. Expectations were written down. Courtesies were spoken aloud. A path took form between principle and need. Brian arrived last, not late, and studied Marjorie the way people read a sentence twice to be sure they have not missed the important word. He was not charming. He was careful. He offered resources threaded through governance, money sharpened into structure that could not flatter him later: matching funds, a community board with authority, oversight resting with Yvette, and, if she accepted, with Marjorie as chair. Nelson nodded at each clause, Darius at each contingency. Marjorie listened and named rules that would keep her whole. She kept her jobs. She set her time. She spoke without scripts. If spin eclipsed service, she walked. Brian accepted conditions like a man relieved to find rails under a moving train. The air between them changed from wary to workable. Days stacked like scaffolding. The city became a sequence of appearances. At a literacy breakfast, Brian stepped back while Marjorie named how transportation blocks access to care. At a museum preview, Nelson redirected reporters and let Yvette speak beneath paintings older than conquest. At a garden tour, Darius routed them away from a telephoto lens perched in a maple and let the roses do the talking. Between events, accidental intimacies formed, a silence in a car that asked better questions than small talk. The way Brian said, "I don't know," without swallowing the words. The way Marjorie smiled with half her face when an idea landed. Brett, a blogger with a grin that clicked like a camera, posted a headline pretending to be a question and functioning as an accusation. Comments divided into those who mistrusted wealth, those who mistrusted women, and those who mistrusted both on principle. Nelson calibrated routes. Darius expanded responsible outlets and declined the rest. Marjorie learned to walk through speculative narratives without acquiring their shape. She kept a notebook of facts to anchor days that threatened to float off script. In private, Brian practiced not controlling what did not belong to him. He missed sometimes. Power is a reflex built in lean years. Nelson watched the misses shrink and the pauses lengthen and began to believe a better superstition. Care can be learned like language if the student is relentless. Brian kept a notebook of questions that expected answers to change him. What does access look like for night shift workers? How do we design a fund immune to donors' moods? Where do people wait when they are not yet patients? He wrote and listened again, and called that a start. Rowena maintained a quiet campaign of reinforcement. She filled a pantry, charged a phone, guarded an afternoon so a nap could exist. She named danger frankly and opportunity by its right name. She did not romanticize men with elevators. She romanticized paperwork signed in good faith and oversight that remained overhead when storms arrived. If respect slipped, she would pull the alarm and trust Marjorie to hear it. Friendship, done properly, is governance with grace. Yvette reminded everyone that the point was Josiah and the thousands like him. She was not sentimental. She was precise about tenderness. When Gideon offered a donation wrapped in clauses that reorganized authority, she smiled and declined with a sentence that left no handhold for argument. He kept smiling. Erosion admired bedrock because it knew time was long. She kept the clinic's center weighted and let the wind exhaust itself on principle. At home, Marjorie taped a list of non-negotiables to her mirror, terms she would not abandon even if the city applauded. Want began to hum louder than fear, not the want of wealth, but the want of agency. Josiah joked about celebrity and asked whether famous people still ate noodles. They did, she promised, thinking of Nelson's dawn meeting and Rowena's message. I'm near and nearer if needed. The apartment held too little and enough, as ordinary spaces do when courage rents the smaller room. From above, the city kept score in lights and headlines. From closer in, something subtler kept score. The way Brian stepped back at microphones so Yvette could step forward. The way Marjorie checked a volunteer's laces before a long shift. The way Nelson edited a schedule to include 10 minutes of quiet no one would notice but everyone would feel. Even Darius, sworn to manage optics, discovered that truth, once centered, defeated scandal more efficiently than spin. This was foundation built to bear weight. Stakes were not abstract here. They had a name, Josiah, and a horizon measured in appointment dates. They had enemies, fatigue, time, and men who thought control was a synonym for care. They also had allies, process, patience, and the discipline to keep choosing the next honest step. Night returned, windows lighting one by one. Somewhere, Gideon studied a calendar and chose an hour when absence would sting. Somewhere, Brett drafted a post about fairy tales beneath fluorescent light and wondered whom it would wound. Somewhere, Brian rehearsed a sentence that admitted fear and asked for better. And in a small apartment, Marjorie set out tomorrow's clothes, folded a note for herself into a pocket, and let sleep have her without debate. Momentum built invisibly. The story's next hinge turned in quiet air, ready to carry what would come. Morning rose from the pavement in steam. Marjorie stepped off the bus with a folder of clinic invoices and walked the line of patients under the awning, greeting each by name. Inside, Yvette stacked pamphlets for the fundraiser, cobalt scarf bright as resolve. Vendors at noon, venue at 2, translators on every floor, she said. She studied Marjorie's eyes and added, hope is not a crime. Rowena's message waited on Marjorie's phone. Eyes up, headlines have teeth. Marjorie sent a heart, then moved charts from a wobbling table to a safer one. She meant to disappear into tasks. Instead, Nelson arrived. He checked the coffee machine and found Yvette and Marjorie. Mr. Knight will be here shortly, he said. He prefers to meet on your ground. Brian entered without retinue, carrying a portfolio. Thank you for making time, he said to Marjorie. The clinic is busy, she said. Let's keep this short. He set the portfolio on a counter. Inside were spreadsheets and a 2-page memo that made generosity behave like infrastructure. I want to underwrite your fundraiser, match community gifts, and endow an access fund that can't be redirected by mood or press cycle. Oversight lives with your board and a community chair you choose. Me? Yvette asked. Or Marjorie, Brian said. Or both, with rules you design. Marjorie read. The plan anonymized donations by policy, tethered success to patient outcomes, and insulated governance from donors' egos. It was not a spotlight. It was bedrock. What do you want? She asked. Public advocacy, Brian said. Appearances that center patients and the clinic, not me. I have access to rooms where decisions move more than applause. I'd like you there before the music starts. Why me? Because you told the truth in a room built of mirrors. Darius slipped in, the PR director whose job was to imagine the worst so the rest could do better. Tabloids will invent motives, he said. Some will dress admiration as suspicion. We can route around part of it, but not all. If exposure threatens your brother's dignity, we stop and reconfigure. The hallway clock clicked. Marjorie thought of rent in envelopes, of Josiah's monitor counting in green, of Rowena's hard love, of the way Brian had chosen restraint when spectacle would have been easy. Terms, she said. I keep my jobs. I choose my schedule. I speak without scripts. If I sense spin, I walk. If the endowment risks becoming leverage for anyone, we publish governance and invite the public to look. The clinic's dignity outranks every donor. Agreed, Brian said, and meant it. Yvette dragged chairs into a circle. They sat. They put deadlines into a shared calendar. They drafted a statement with numbers and one declarative sentence about respect. Nelson rearranged Brian's afternoon. Elsewhere, Gideon read a summary of the memo and disliked the physics. He called Brett with a suggestion disguised as a question and booked 2 meetings, one with a firm that sold discretion, one with a foundation that prized liquidity over loyalty. Rowena texted again, "Do not let nice suits reset your compass." Marjorie replied, "My compass is bolted to the floor." She wrote her non-negotiables on a sticky note and slid it into her wallet. At noon, Brian and Marjorie crossed the waiting room together. No cameras, no statement yet. A patient asked when the coffee machine would work. Brian treated it like a directive. By 3, he told Nelson. They stepped outside. The storm had rinsed the street. Nelson opened a car door Marjorie refused out of habit. Brian didn't press. He offered a card with a number that reached him and said, "If the clinic needs anything urgent, including silence." "Silence is expensive," she said. "I can afford it," he answered, drawing a line. They parted without theater. Marjorie crossed to the pharmacy, winced at a total, and counted pills into a paper bag as if they were minutes she could save. Brian sat in the back seat and watched the neighborhood pass, counting reasons faster than quarters. In an office tower, Gideon charted a misunderstanding. In a coffee shop, Brett drafted a headline that pretended to ask and accused. By late afternoon, the clinic inbox held 3 small donations and 1 insult. Yvette forwarded the gifts and deleted bile. Marjorie logged volunteer shifts, rode the bus home with a tote full of pamphlets. Josiah had arranged 2 bowls and a spoon like a ceremony waiting for soup. "How famous are we?" he asked. "We're a rumor," she said, setting water to boil. "Rumors can't sign forms." He snorted, then blinked slow. Fatigue stole his punchlines first. She timed his meds between spoonfuls and watched relief soften his face as the numbers on his monitor settled. Want began to hum louder than fear, not want of wealth, but want of days. Across the river, Brian stood before glass that braided his reflection with the city's. He wrote in a notebook because paper slowed his certainty. What would a system look like that functions when I am gone? Where does my presence help, and where does it distort? He underlined the second question twice. Night layered over the clinic, the apartment, the tower, the coffee shop. A technician set a part aside for a machine he would fix at dawn. Gideon scheduled a storm. Brett arranged sentences into a verdict with a question mark. Nelson synced calendars. Darius deleted 2 drafted responses and chose to make the work visible instead. The day ended without a press release, without a handshake photo, without catharsis. It ended with work beginning, which is how real inciting incidents hide in plain sight. Agreement had become motion. Boundaries had become rails. Somewhere, a woman chose a path that would not flatter her, but might save what she loved. And a man used power like a tool he was learning to hold correctly. The city did not notice, not yet, but the story did, and moved its weight onto a new hinge, preparing to turn. Evening rehearsed itself in the mirrored studio Nelson had secured in a quiet wing of the museum. Under paintings of storms tamed into oil, Marjorie practiced the practical arts, how to hold a microphone without surrendering her certainty, how to pause for meaning, how to redirect a question toward patience without sounding defensive. Nelson demonstrated steady as a metronome. "Power will try to make you speak its language," he said. "Answer in yours." Brian watched from the last row, arms loose, eyes attentive, learning where to subtract himself so the point could breathe. Outside, cameras fluttered like moths. Darius tested exits, read reflections in glass, and issued soft instructions that felt like umbrellas opening. "Left stairwell, loading dock, street," he murmured. If approached, pivot to literacy numbers. If pressed about romance, pivot to governance. Marjorie nodded, amused by the choreography and grateful for a map that let dignity keep its footing. She would not be curated, and yet she could accept shelter that did not cost her voice. The garden event arrived with lanterns threaded through lemon trees, the air bright with citrus and low strings. Yvette spoke first, voice clear as a bell. Brian stood at the back with staff, declining the stage offered to him. When a donor with a sunburned laugh asked Marjorie if she planned to graduate from charity work now that she had prospects, she let the question land, then replaced it. "Prospects look like a waiting room at 3 a.m. and a working coffee machine," she said. The crowd chuckled. The donor apologized. Donations rose by small, honest increments. 2 hours later, Brett's post dropped, a carousel of photos with a caption that pretended to wonder while declaring, "From catering tray to penthouse play?" The comments forked into poison and defense. Algorithms harvested both. Nelson muted noise at the route level, but it seeped like humidity. Rowena sent a single message, breath in, truth out, and Marjorie breathed. Brian did something no one saw. He ordered nothing. He called no editor, launched no counterattack, issued no threat. He answered clinic emails about translation volunteers and reviewed the endowment draft with a pencil, striking his own veto power from a clause that did not need it. When Nelson entered, Brian asked only, "What keeps this most accountable?" Nelson said, "Publish the minutes." Brian said, "Do it." Gideon sent an invitation engraved with smoke, a high-stakes auction for a rare manuscript whose proceeds, he wrote, would elevate whichever neighborhood clinic demonstrates the nimblest stewardship. The message was bait and insult at once. Darius read it twice. "He wants philanthropy to be a duel," he said. "If we skip it, we look timid. If we attend, he'll stage a choice that harms someone." Yvette's jaw set. "We attend," she said, "and we reroute the choice." Preparation sharpened. Felix, a quiet specialist introduced by Nelson as curious about patterns, mapped the velocity of Brett's story, noting bot clusters and recycled stock avatars. He found a shell account reposting the smear at disciplined intervals, a rhythm like a metronome in another room. "Not proof," Felix cautioned, "but a shape worth watching." By the second week of rehearsals, Marjorie and Brian became a duet without naming it. She took the lectern. He managed lights and time. She answered a hostile question with data. He lifted a hand to cede the remaining minutes to Yvette. When a photographer shouted, "Look in love," Brian pocketed his hands and looked at the exit instead. Later, under the atrium's glass ribs, Marjorie studied him as he failed to perform charm and felt the pull of an honesty rarer than charisma. Small moments accrued. Brian handed his jacket to an elderly donor shivering under a vent and refused credit. Marjorie adjusted a volunteer's lanyard and asked about her grandmother by name. In the car, they spoke of things that would never make a headline. Midnight buses, the price of printer ink, how to make waiting rooms kinder. The city kept score in other currencies. Their ledgers filled anyway. Obstacles hardened. A freelancer misquoted a joke into a sneer and ran it as evidence of arrogance. A shipping delay threatened the clinic's new pediatric cuffs. The coffee machine, despite promises, sputtered into theater again. Brian arrived with a repairman and a toolbox he had no idea how to use. Marjorie laughed and handed him a towel. He held screws like fragile birds while the technician restored pressure to water. When the first stream sighed through, applause broke out in the waiting room. Brian stood back so it could belong to the staff who needed it most. False clues crept in with the mail. An anonymous envelope carried a receipt purporting to show a payment from the endowment to a consulting firm that did not exist last month. Felix studied the typography, smiled without mirth, and slid it into a clear sleeve. "Someone wants us to chase smoke," he said. Darius built a shelf labeled, "Do not dignify." Nelson added, "Keep records immaculate anyway." Practice bred fluency. Brian learned to answer, "I don't know," without swallowing the words. Marjorie learned that accepting help and surrendering control were different verbs. They argued once about the order of speakers at a breakfast. She insisted a nurse go first. He worried press would leave. She won. The nurse spoke about a hallway at 3 a.m., where a good chair is medicine. Coverage doubled. The auction night rose like a curtain. Clarissa's venue shimmered in glass and candlelight. The manuscript rested under a plexiglass dome, light pooling on its vellum like dawn pressed flat. Gideon glided through greetings, immaculate in midnight. "What a pleasure," he told Brian, "to watch you return to the theater." Brian returned a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "We brought our own script." Yvette spoke first again. She outlined a proposal that made the funds co-governed by neighborhood clinics with transparent metrics and rotating leadership impossible for any one donor to dominate. The room recalibrated. Gideon laughed as if delighted. "Bold," he said, "and yet so decentralized." He turned to Marjorie. "And you? Will you keep this man honest?" Compliment and blade. "He keeps himself honest," she said evenly. "I keep the clinic honest. Hungry patients keep us both." Bids rose. Gideon doubled one casually, then withdrew with a shrug when the number crossed a threshold only confidence would risk. Brian lifted a paddle once, then did not lift it again. Instead, after the gavel, he announced a matching fund for any clinic that adopted Yvette's governance model. His name absent from the program, his limits spelled out. The room murmured, confused by generosity that refused to brand itself. Brett, on the balcony, photographed confusion like scandal. Felix, from the back, noted which phones moved before headlines did. Nelson wrote down times. Darius drafted a short release and cut every adjective. After, on stone steps cooling under a cloudless sky, Brian and Marjorie stood in a circle of ordinary air. The manuscript had gone to a collector with a librarian's hands. The governance model had found 3 new adopters. The smear kept humming online, a bad song you could not stop hearing. "I can't stop them from composing it," Brian said, "but I can drown it with better music." "You don't have to drown anything," Marjorie said. "Just keep the tempo steady." He looked at her then, the weight in his gaze not possession but attention. "You do that," he said. "I'm learning." A distant siren threaded the night. They turned toward its note as if measuring the distance between crisis and calm, then walked down the steps side by side, not touching, matched in stride, the city keeping time with them. The hospital's lights burned too white, too steady when Marjorie was called in the middle of the night. Josiah's oxygen had dipped again, his chart flagged with red notes. She arrived with her chest already aching, the world shrinking to the soft hiss of machines. Brian was there before she asked, his presence a question and an answer at once. Nelson had driven him. Yvette had smoothed permission with the nurses. He stood at the foot of Josiah's bed, jacket in his hand, posture subdued as if reverence could steady the boy's breathing. "Why are you here?" Marjorie whispered. "Because you are," Brian said simply. Josiah's lashes fluttered, his small hand tightening on Marjorie's. "Don't worry," he murmured, his voice scratchy. "I'll sleep it off." She kissed his knuckles and fought the tide. "You don't have to promise me strength you don't have," she told him. But when his eyes shut, she bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. When the silence stretched, Brian crossed to the window, his reflection stark against the storm outside. "You should know why I am the way I am?" His voice was quiet, shaped more by regret than pride. Marjorie's heart stilled. "Go on." "Years ago, Gideon offered me partnership. I trusted him. I trusted the woman I was going to marry. Together, they cut me open. She fed him my plans, my timelines, my vulnerabilities. He shorted the deal he'd urged me to lever. By morning, I had lost millions, nearly the company itself, and her. I learned that love is a blade, and trust is leverage." He dragged a hand across his jaw, eyes shadowed. "Coldness was my shield. It worked. It also cost me pieces of myself I thought were unneeded." Marjorie stared at him, stunned by the nakedness of his confession. For the first time, she saw not the empire or the legend, but the man who had been broken before he hardened. "You're not the only one who measured life in betrayals," she whispered. "When Josiah's illness worsened, I promised I'd never ask for help. I thought if I could carry it all, nothing could be taken from us. But it's lonely, Brian. Lonely to always be the strong one." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. He looked at her as though her honesty was the only truth he'd been waiting for. "I can help," he said. "Not as charity, as a partner, as someone who refuses to let you shoulder this alone." Her chest heaved. "If I accept, it has to be on my terms. No rescues. No cages." His mouth curved, not a businessman's smile, but something closer to relief. "Agreed." The monitor beeped steadily now. Josiah's breathing had calmed. Relief loosened Marjorie's spine. She sank into the chair at his bedside, exhaustion coating her bones. Brian remained nearby, silent, steady. Minutes blurred. At last, she lifted her face to him, the air between them weighted with things unspoken. He leaned closer, and for the first time, she didn't resist. Their lips met, quiet, tentative, nothing like the stories promised. It wasn't fire. It was sanctuary. A kiss that said, "I see you. I believe you. I'm here." When they parted, their foreheads lingered together. No promises, no speeches. Just two souls daring to believe they might not have to walk alone anymore. The next evening, the auction hall gleamed with chandeliers and danger. Clarissa welcomed donors with the grace of a queen. Gideon prowled like a shadow dressed in silk, his laughter smooth as poison. Marjorie stood at Brian's side, her dress borrowed from Yvette, her chin lifted with Rowena's words echoing in her ear. Never let them mistake silence for weakness. The bidding began. Gideon's gaze found Brian, smug and daring, each raise of his paddle meant to provoke. "Still in the game after all these years?" he called across the floor. Brian's jaw clenched, but his voice was calm. "This isn't a game, Gideon. It's people's lives." When the manuscript's price climbed, Gideon smirked. "Careful. Wouldn't want your companion caught in the fallout. Headlines are already sharp, aren't they, Marjorie? The crowd murmured. Heat rushed to her cheeks. Before she could answer, Brian lifted his paddle and placed a bid that silenced the room. Gideon faltered, mask cracking for just a breath. Brian won, but when the gavel fell, he turned not to bask in victory but to face the audience. His voice carried with a power born not of money, but conviction. These funds will not rest in one man's hands, not even mine. They will be co-managed by Yvette's board and by Marjorie, whose integrity speaks louder than lies. No single donor controls the future of this clinic. Not me. Not anyone. The hall erupted in applause, genuine, startled, grateful. Gideon's smile froze, brittle as glass. Marjorie felt her chest swell, pride and disbelief tangling. Brian had not just defended her. He had trusted her enough to share the power everyone assumed he'd hoard. When the evening ended, she stood beside him on the marble steps, the city humming beyond. For once, the silence between them was not heavy. It was full. "You didn't have to put my name out there," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, "because it belongs there." Her hand brushed his, tentative, not quite holding. He didn't move away. The night wrapped them both, fragile and infinite. Rain blurred the city into streaks when the story detonated. Brett's headline landed like a dropped plate. Clinic Angel exposed, payments, private dinners, and a fast-tracked fund. A carousel of photos paired Marjorie's face with screenshots that looked official, deposits labeled consulting, cropped texts implying she traded affection for access, a spreadsheet rerouting line items through a shell vendor. It felt close enough to plausible to be poison. In the clinic break room, Yvette scrolled once and stopped. "We don't feed this," she said, tone level. She handed Marjorie the phone. The numbers wore her name like a mask. The words weren't hers. Heat rose and then dropped away, leaving a cold clarity that hurt to hold. "Felix?" Marjorie asked. "Already on it," Yvette said, dialing. Across the river, Darius had the post open before Brian finished his espresso. He zoomed the images to inspect edges. "Composite artifacts," he said to Nelson when the door swung. Convincing, they used real calendar metadata. "She needs to hear from him now," Nelson said. Brian stared at the screen until past and present braided. Forged messages, a lover's duplicity, Gideon's voice in the middle distance. He reached for his phone. Half a second passed, barely a breath, exactly enough, and then he dialed. Voicemail. Felix reached the clinic and spread printouts on a table. "Source files were seeded last week," he said. "A forked spreadsheet template, transaction hashes fabricated, the bank watermark wrong by 2 pixels. The text thread uses an outdated bubble style. This is a frame." "Brett won't care," Rowena said, wrists folded tight. "Rumor pays." "We will," Yvette answered. "And our auditors. Still, appointments will wobble." The phones began to ring with cancellations. 2 donors paused, pending clarification. A vendor demanded prepayment. The coffee machine coughed itself to silence. Marjorie kept moving through the waiting room like calm in shoes, showing panic how to breathe. Inside, something tore. Brian arrived at noon with Darius and Nelson, coat dark from rain. Heads turned, whispers braided. Marjorie met him halfway, hands open but firm. "Say you believe me," she said quietly. He stalled on the cliff where fear lives. "I'm verifying. For you and for the clinic. A measured response prevents more damage." Her expression didn't crumble. It set. "After all the governance, after you struck your veto, after you watched me audit with you, you're verifying me?" He hated himself in real time. "I won't dance to Gideon's tempo." "Tempo isn't his alone," she said. She stepped back so the distance could be witnessed. "Fix it, but not near me." She turned to Yvette. "Put me in back office until the note clears, patients first." Rowena appeared with the efficiency of someone who rehearses departures. "I'll close her routes," she told Nelson without looking at him, then steered Marjorie toward the staff corridor. The hinge of the day snapped. Darius's phone buzzed. "Statement?" he asked. "Publish procurement logs and governance minutes for the quarter," Brian said, voice cooled to metal. "Announce a third-party review with full access. Name what we know and where we're blind, no adjectives." "Understood." "Felix?" "I'm mapping the botnet," Felix said through speaker. "The shell vendor didn't exist 2 months ago. The incorporation agent links to a trust used in 3 of Gideon's plays. Not court-proof yet." "Get me court-proof," Brian said, and felt the old coat of certainty slide onto his shoulders. By evening, cancellations outnumbered bookings. A pharmaceutical rep postponed a shipment until optics clear. The pledge counter froze. Yvette gathered staff and named truth under pressure. Steady procedures, transparent records, care not contingent on applause. Spines straightened, then bent back to work. Marjorie spent the night rebuilding transport schedules by hand when the algorithm buckled. She didn't doom scroll. She stacked paper into order and reminded herself that a schedule is a kind of faith. When the monitor on Josiah's wrist pulsed an alert, she reset sensors with precise hands and a voice trained not to shake. He blinked awake. "Bad day?" "The kind we outlast," she said. Across the river, Brian cut meetings, called counsel, drilled through numbers until numbers blurred. He authorized the audit to exceed policy and rewrote Darius's draft to erase comfort. He did not call Marjorie again. The absence stamped itself on the night like frost. Around midnight, Nelson placed tea on the desk. "You can fix the facts," he said. "You can't fix the pause." "I know," Brian said, the confession scouring his throat. "Say it out loud." I hesitated. In that space, she heard every betrayal she ever carried. "Handle what you can handle," Nelson said. "Then do the part that isn't tactical." Morning brought quieter phones and louder headlines. Brett posted a follow-up with exclusive sources. Gideon attended a breakfast and performed surprise. Darius released the logs and review plan anyway. The board co-signed. A small donor doubled her gift with a note. "Keep going." Another wrote, "Disappointed. Watching." Both mattered. Marjorie arrived early, hair wet from a sink, gaze steady. She pressed new schedules into Yvette's hands, hugged Rowena without breaking, and went to the back to assemble intake packets. When Brian stepped into the hallway, she did not stop. He didn't block her. They passed like weather systems, pressure falling. By afternoon, Felix had mapped the smear to the Shell Trust with 90% confidence. He sent the dossier to Darius, to Yvette's board, to counsel. "One more link," he said, "and we can go public without caveats. Patience has a burn rate." "What about hers?" Nelson asked after the call clicked off. Brian faced the window and disliked the man reflected there. Efficient, exacting, ready to win the wrong war. He thought of a hospital room, a boy pretending sleep meant safety, a woman asking for belief, and the fraction of a second he had left empty. He picked up his phone and, for once, didn't draft the sentence first. He dialed and held. Voicemail. He left nothing. Sometimes silence is cowardice. Sometimes it is mercy. Too late now. Morning arrived undecided. Felix had not slept. He lined printouts across his kitchen table, timestamps, IP hops, incorporation filings, payment gateways that looked clean until you tilted them to the light. One cluster repeated a beat too perfect. A shell foundation created 2 months ago, funded by transfers routed through a donor-advised account tied to a trust that kept appearing near Gideon's ventures. The repost network moved like a metronome. He called Nelson first. Nelson listened, then asked 3 questions. Standard of proof, risk to the clinic, fastest path to independent verification. 92% confidence on the chain, Felix said. We'll need subpoenas for the last lift, but we can publish a brief that shows mechanics without libel. Draft it, Nelson said. Board and council see it before it moves. Brian stood at his window when Nelson relayed the map. He wore yesterday's suit minus certainty. He pictured Marjorie's face at the instant he hesitated, the way belief left the room. He had defended himself against humiliation so well he had humiliated himself anyway. "I chose fear," he said, alone first, then to Nelson, "because it felt responsible." Nelson didn't console. "Do the next right thing," he answered. "Precisely, not theatrically." "At the clinic," Brian said. "No cameras." Morning looked like resilience there. Staff reset chairs, restocked rooms, turned the phones to low ring. Marjorie's station in the back was a quiet engine. Transportation grids updated, intake packets folded, a hand-drawn sign, "Coffee, soon," taped above an unplugged machine. Rowena kept pace, translating worry into action, snacks, chargers, ride lists. They spoke little. The work spoke. Yvette received Brian in a conference room. Darius stayed outside. Nelson sat to keep time. Brian did not sit. He placed a folder on the table and kept his hands visible. "I'm sorry," he said. "I hesitated when she needed belief. I can explain why, but explanation protects me. Tell me how to repair what my doubt cost." Yvette regarded him the way surgeons regard a wound they might accept as theirs to close. "Publish everything that clears her," she said. "Fund an independent PR shield for community clinics, not just ours, so the next smear has somewhere to die. Leave our governance unchanged, especially the parts that restrain you, and apologize to her where there is no audience." "I'll do all of that," he said. "And one more thing," Yvette added. "Don't compete with her resilience. Stand beside it." Felix arrived with pages clipped. He briefed counsel and Yvette, the Shell Foundation's birth, the trust's money, the botnet contracts, Brett's payment schedule, the repost pattern spiking when Gideon's name trended. He diagrammed, not dramatized. "Enough to state the mechanism and name the shell," counsel said. "We can't accuse Gideon yet, but the trail invites questions only law can answer." "Publish with humility," Yvette said. "No victory laps." Brian checked the clock. "I need to speak to Rowena." Rowena met him in a hall painted the color of patience. She crossed her arms and stood like a door that wouldn't open accidentally. "You want to fix this fast?" she said. "You can't airlift trust." "I know," he answered. "I failed her precisely where her life trained her to be abandoned." Rowena's mouth softened, not into forgiveness, but recognition. "Good sentence," she said. "Now live it. Don't perform remorse. Carry the boring weight. Stack chairs. Fetch water. If you speak, say ordinary things. Accept no for as long as it takes." He nodded, and something like breath returned to his chest. At noon, the brief went live on the clinic site and the auditor's page. A technical explainer, a timeline, a pledge to cooperate with law enforcement, and a note from the board underscoring Marjorie's integrity and the protections in place. Screenshots stamped as composites, the Shell Foundation named with its filings attached. Reporters who cared retweeted. Bots kept humming. People who had been waiting to believe found a foothold. Gideon read the brief and smiled without teeth. He called the boutique firm, spoke in questions, and hung up convinced his name would remain 2 doors from liability. Brett posted a thread about questions raised and quietly locked his booking portal. Brian walked the long way to the back office. He stopped at the doorway. Marjorie did not look up immediately. She finished labeling a stack before raising her eyes. She did not stand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I believed the worst pattern at the worst time. It was my fear, not your actions. I can't ask you to forgive me. I can only ask for instructions." Her face didn't move for a breath, then 2. "Instructions," she repeated. "Fine. Patients in 2A need water cups sorted. The elevator sticks between 3 and 4. Take the stairs with supply boxes. When the coffee part arrives, learn to install it. And stop absorbing blame like it's noble. Do the work." "I will," he said. He carried boxes. He stacked chairs. He fetched paper. Nelson watched with a small smile. Darius sent the brief to outlets that chose accuracy. Yvette met with the auditor and set dates on a calendar the hallway could see. In the late afternoon, a woman in 2A asked Brian for directions. He walked her there and memorized the detours. On his third trip up the stairs, he passed Marjorie going down. They did not touch, but something in the air eased the smallest degree, like a knot trying to remember how to slip. At sunset, Nelson found Rowena in the lobby, arms full of cleaned blankets. "Is he doing it right?" he asked. "He's not making himself the story," she said. "That's the only right that matters." They stood in light that turned the scuffed floor to bronze. The day did not end in triumph. It ended in effort now. Somewhere a fax number would become a subpoena field. Somewhere a smear would lose traction because boredom had replaced flame. And in a back office with bad lighting, two people relearned the grammar of ordinary repair. Clarissa's ballroom glittered like a promise that money could behave. The follow-up gala moved with polished calm, donors bright. Outside, a thin protest line asked for truth. Inside, two lecterns waited, a projector ready to cast receipts into light. Marjorie arrived with Yvette and Rowena, neither hiding nor courting attention. She wore calm like armor, hair pinned, gaze steady enough to steady others. The smear still clung to headlines, yet the clinic's brief had shifted the floor. People leaned toward facts again. Nelson walked the exits. Darius tuned the room's temperature with sentences he hoped not to use. Behind the curtain, Brian flexed empty hands. Felix checked the HDMI, checksum, timestamps, then checked again like ritual could anchor truth. "Once clean. Enough," Felix said. "Mechanism, not vengeance." Brian nodded. He had rehearsed a sentence until it was not performance. I hesitated where belief should have lived. Tonight he would not outsource courage. Clarissa welcomed the room with unflappable polish. "We gather twice," she smiled, "once to promise and once to prove." Applause swelled, expectant. Gideon watched from a shadowed table, amused. Brett hovered near the press rail, phone primed to amplify whichever current won. Yvette spoke first. She named numbers and people. Screenings increased, translators hired, night shift hours added, coffee functional. She thanked small donors by category instead of size, and the room's spine straightened. Then she gestured toward the wings. "Transparency is not a press release," she said. "It is a habit. Brian?" He walked out without music. The screen behind him lit with a plain title, "How a Lie Traveled." "A story painted a woman I respect as a grifter," he said. It used composites, shell entities, and volume to masquerade as truth. Here is what actually happened. Felix advanced slides, bot patterns, creation dates, incorporation filings, payment gateways, repost clusters that pulsed exactly on the hour. He highlighted the Shell Foundation's birth and the donor-advised account that fed it. He showed the transaction watermark error and the outdated message style, fingerprints of forgery. His voice stayed even. Brian continued. "Our auditors and counsel have the trail. We've referred it to authorities. We will not speculate about motive. Facts deserve stronger instruments than microphones." That settled. He placed a folder on the podium. One more correction. Power in this fund belongs where it should. Effective tonight, I am removed entirely from control. Oversight rests with Yvette, with Marjorie, and with a rotating community seat. Minutes and audits will be public. The room shifted. First surprise, then the uneasy awe felt when wealth steps back on purpose. Cameras clicked like rain. Clarissa's eyes brightened. Rowena allowed herself one breath. Marjorie's throat tightened at the gesture's plainness. Gideon clapped alone, soft and sardonic. "Magnificent theater," he called. "Shame about the villain you won't name." Brian didn't look at him. "The mechanism is named," he said. "The rest belongs to courts, not ballrooms." A ripple moved through the press rail. Brett's phone buzzed, his publisher's counsel forwarded a letter. The projector changed again. Felix, within rights, displayed an email chain. a freelancer pitching the smear, a payment order from the Shell Foundation, a schedule that matched Brett's posting cadence. Redactions guarded private data. The path remained. Brett lowered his phone, color draining. The doors at the back opened to a different gravity. Anthony, counsel retained by the board, entered with 2 investigators. Not a raid, an appointment. He approached Gideon's table with courtesy sharpened into steel. "You were served earlier," Anthony said. "We're here to preserve devices and records tied to the named entities." Gideon's smile thinned. "Ghastly to mistake philanthropy for criminal procedure?" "Philanthropy is welcome," Anthony replied. "Forgery travels poorly." He set a small envelope down. "Chain of custody instructions." Cameras swung. Clarissa redirected the quartet into warmer chords that softened edges without erasing consequence. Darius signaled the house to dim aisles and brighten stage, guiding attention back to process. Yvette stepped forward again. "Our work continues," she said simply. "If you wish to help, give." Applause rose, first dutiful, then real. Several donors approached the pledge wall. Brian left the stage and stood beside a column, heartbeat stubborn. Relief didn't come. Something quieter did. The weight he'd put down redistributed into purpose. Marjorie found him there, arriving the way one returns to a familiar bench. The music softened their voices. "You did what you said," she murmured. "I should have done it sooner," he answered. "I don't want conquest. I want covenant, terms you write, time you own, truths we refuse to mortgage." She studied him, measuring the distance between promise and practice. "Covenant is work," she said. "It's ordinary. Can you live ordinary with me? Broken coffee, waiting rooms, plans that scrape their knees." "Yes," he said, steady as a signed form. "On your terms, with my whole name." Rowena watched and did not interfere. Nelson pretended to check lights and hid a smile. The quartet slipped into a melody that knew about survival. Marjorie didn't melt, she chose. She reached for his hand, not to be led, but to walk even. He matched, not pulling, not pressing. The choice made, something inside both of them unclenched like a fist, learning it could be a palm. Clarissa announced totals, higher than forecast, most of it in modest gifts. Yvette thanked the room and reconsecrated it. Felix shut his laptop with the quiet satisfaction of an engineer whose bridge held. Darius sent a 3-line release. Anthony collected signatures and vanished into the necessary night. Outside, the protest line lingered. Some had become donors. Some nodded as the couple passed. The air smelled like wet stone and beginning. Brian and Marjorie paused under a modest awning, rain stitching silver between streetlights. "No more mirrors," she said. "No more armor," he replied. They stepped into the rain together, not to be seen, but to get where they were going. Behind them, the ballroom kept glittering, but the work had already moved outside into weather, into hands, into a future that would require both spine and tenderness in equal measure.
Sun lifts over the city like a promise, and for the first time in years, I believe. The clinic doors slide open at 7. I'm there with a dolly of boxes no one asked me to. Habit once told me to command. Today I choose errands. Marjorie meets me in the hallway, hair pulled back, badge clipped, eyes bright with sleep she didn't get. She taps the clipboard to my forearm. "Room 2B is low on cups," she says. "Coffee part came. Think you can follow instructions?" "I'm teachable," I answer. Josiah waves from the waiting area, earbuds around his neck. The board signed his treatment timeline last week. The dates sit in a shared calendar I do not own. Relief looks good on him. He asks if I know how to fix a toaster. I can burn toast without machinery, I tell him. He grins, then leaves with a volunteer. Yvette moves through like weather that improves a room. She hands me an outreach flyer from Marjorie's new team. Mobile screenings, night shift hours, translation hotlines, bus vouchers. My name is nowhere, that is the point. "We need folding chairs," she says, "and fire extinguishers checked." I fetch, I sign, I learn which broom doesn't squeak. Nelson appears with a wry smile. He says the auditors closed their review with language so clear even tabloids repeated it. Darius arrives, pockets full of pens, surrendering a line I never expected. Love, managed properly, is excellent public relations because it happens to be true. I tell him I prefer the version where love is simply excellent. He shrugs. News rolls in like surf. Gideon's charges are formal. Anthony forwards filings. Brett posts a recantation threaded with apologies. I read to the end and choose not to gloat. Vindication is a loud room. Dignity is a key that locks it. By late morning, the coffee machine purrs. I install the new valve under Marjorie's supervision while Rowena times us. When the first stream runs right, the waiting room applauds. A grandfather raises his cup at me. I raise mine back, grateful for a skill that asks only patience and hot water. At noon, Marjorie convenes the first outreach stand-up as director. The staff forms a circle: nurses, translators, drivers, 2 new hires. She assigns tasks, asks questions, listens until people finish. She looks like command without theater. I sit on a crate in the doorway, taking minutes no one needs. When she catches me watching, I look down and keep writing. We have both learned things about power. Afternoon thins into amber. Josiah returns with instructions and an expression that says there is a map forward. He high-fives me, then collapses beside Marjorie and tells her which cartoons the IV pump should stream tomorrow. Rowena claims dinner duty and sends us home. You two, she says, pointing a spoon she has somehow produced, are off the clock. Her apartment glows a soft ordinary I didn't know I craved. I change the toaster setting and still burn the first slice. Marjorie laughs. I try again, succeed, and butter the toast while she plates eggs. We stand close but not needy. The counter holds 2 mugs, equal in size, chipped differently. Power lies there in plain sight, shared, unstated, steady. I keep thinking about the gala, I tell her. How a room built for mirrors watched you call me what I was. I deserved the name then. You deserved someone to answer you with love, she says. I wasn't ready to believe a man like you could. Neither was I admit. Breakfast becomes a ceremony of competence. I pour without spilling. She salts without measuring. We eat leaning against the counter, ankle to ankle, making plans that fit on envelopes. Library partnerships, school nurse drop-ins, vendor lists that can't be gamed, a potluck with translators so intake forms learn better metaphors. My phone vibrates with good news. The rotating community seat voted in Yvette's former intern. Clarissa's board pledged to match bus vouchers for a year. The protest line has become volunteers. I set the phone face down. The habit to chase impact still tugs. I let it pass. Choosing us is part of choosing the work. After dishes, we walk. The city smells like wet stone and bread. In a bookstore window, a card recommends a novel about 2 people who choose again and again. Marjorie reads it aloud, amused. That's us, I say. Unfashionably consistent. She threads her fingers through mine. We don't need to declare anything. The day does it for us. Evening finds us back at the clinic for teen drop-in hours she funded first. I stack chairs. She mediates a debate about the best noodles. Darius stops by to surrender a press request. Nelson drops off a toolbox labeled properly. Felix appears with pastries and no agenda. We take a photo for the wall that faces inward. Not for the internet, just for the staff who keep choosing. When the last bus leaves, we return to the apartment. The kettle sings. I burn the toast again on purpose. She laughs on purpose. The future does not feel cinematic. It feels like a calendar full of boxes we plan to fill with integrity until the page runs out and we turn the next. Before sleep, I stand at the window and watch the city keep its promise. The smear is a past tense noun. Gideon will answer to courts. Brett will learn slower truths. Nelson finally smiles. Yvette texts a photo of the coffee machine with a gold star. Rowena sends a dragon napping. Josiah replies with his chart and a caption. Plot twist. Hope. I switch off the light and lie beside the woman who taught me the difference between conquest and covenant. The last thing I feel is her hand finding mine, the simplest contract I have ever signed. Do you think the strongest love stories begin with conflict or with instant understanding? Tell us your take in the comments.